There's this wonderful and famous moment in The Matrix when somebody sees the same cat twice, realizes they're having deja vu, and Trinity says, "Oh, that's a glitch in the Matrix," which is just such a wonderful phrase. The idea is actually quite an important one in Western culture. I mean, the idea is that what we think is the real is this surface, but it's not really the real. And occasionally something breaks. There's a glitch. And the truth of what's real, what's underneath this seeming surface, is exposed, and that what's exposed, that reality that's exposed, is grim. In the case of The Matrix, and this is a spoiler for the first one, it's that we, in fact, are just bodies that have been harnessed for power and are being fed the Matrix. This idea of a surface underneath which is the really real goes back at least to the ancient Greeks. But generally, what they saw underneath the surface to them seemed to be this swirling mass of unpredictable, chaotic, and dangerous stuff, life. But underneath it, there's in fact an order that explains it. And this order is beautiful, it's mathematically beautiful, it's reasonable, it's the logos. That basic architecture is still with us, although at some point it started to flip so that what was exposed was not this beautiful eternal order, but the brute force of reality, where the real means the stuff that's there, even if we're not aware of it, even after we're dead, even if nobody's paying attention to it. The real is the stuff that is there. And one of the places you can see this surfacing, there's lots of them, but one of them, a famous one again, is Dr. Johnson's response to Bishop Berkeley, an important philosopher of the time, 18th century, who was an idealist in the sense that Berkeley thought that there is no real world in our ordinary sense. It's all ideas. It's very much like the Matrix. We're being fed ideas, visions, senses, and all the rest of it, but by God, who's therefore giving us truthful ideas. And Samuel Johnson was asked about this, and he famously kicked a rock that was embedded in the ground and said, "I refute it thus," which is, when you think about it, not much of a refutation, because Berkeley, of course, he recognizes that people stub their toes, but he assumes this is all part of this sensory information that is being fed to us by God. In any case, this is a case where, stubbing your toe is an intrusion of the real into your everyday world, your surface world, because you didn't intend to, and it hurt. It's sort of just a brute fact that's there, whether you like it or not. The rock is there. We see this idea sort of gain strength and maybe reaches its maximum. It's hard to say that sort of thing, but at least let's say a maximum. In the work of Jean-Paul Sartre, who was a 20th century philosopher, but also a novelist. In fact, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was probably annoyed he didn't get it for philosophy, for his philosophical work, but it doesn't matter. He rejected it anyway for political reasons. His first novel, one of his most famous, is called Nausea. And it was actually a very important novel to me, as well as culturally. Quite important as well. And in it, the protagonist, I'm going to tell you his name, but I'm only going to tell you once, and you'll understand why once I do it. The protagonist, Roquetin. My French is not, it's not. Let's just leave it there. So the protagonist is sitting on a bench underneath this magnificent chestnut tree. It's so old that its roots have entwined around the bench itself. And for some reason, at that moment, the surface world, the deceptive and false deceptive world of everyday appearances falls away for the protagonist. And he sees the chestnut tree for what it really is. It's just matter, but you can't even call it matter because that's a human projection too. It rejects the protagonist's attempt to project a meaning onto it. You can't even give it a name. It doesn't care about a name. It's just there. It's independent of our awareness of it. And for Sartre, this was a moment of revelation. This is the truth of the world in some sense. It is the grimmest of truths. So this affected me very deeply because I read it when I was in college in the 1960s, and I was already pretty depressed and anxious, and had the sense that things only had meaning because I was projecting meaning onto them. Nothing had real meaning. Where real, once again, means exists apart from me, exists apart from human awareness. And so this book gave me a very clear vision of this, which further depressed me in a psychological sense, psychological anxiety and depression, which I came out of. I got into it through philosophy, at least in part, and I got out of it, at least in part, through philosophy as well, because I took some courses with a professor that I truly loved, Joseph Pfell. I stayed in touch with him until he died a couple of years ago. And it was a course on Heidegger, Martin Heidegger. Now, Sartre was in some sense a student of Heidegger. It felt like he was in conversation with Heidegger, which you can see if only because Sartre's first big book of philosophy was he called Being and Nothingness in 1943, and very clearly a reference back to Heidegger's first big book of philosophy in 1927, which was Being and Time. In Being and Time, Heidegger also recognizes that there are moments in our everyday life when we have a glitch-like moment. And what seems to be a truth breaks through our everyday experience. And so he talks about this in terms of broken tools. Just one prominent and sort of standard example for talking about Heidegger, the broken hammer. Because when you're using a hammer, you're using it as part of a larger project. You're using it in order to do something, and you're thinking about that future project, and it has meaning both in terms of the project and that you want, but also in terms of, as everything does, as a part of this literally global, or in some sense universal, context of relational meaning. So you know what a hammer is because you also know what nails are and how nails go into lumber, and lumber comes from trees, and that means you also understand that trees grow in an ecosystem with sun and with water and all the rest of it. And so ordinary things in ordinary experience have meaning that they get from their place in this enormous web of meaning. But then the hammer breaks. And you look at it, and it's a lump of metal with a stick next to it, and you realize that that's what it is. Apart from us, a hammer has no act. It just sits there. It resists our attempt to project meaning onto it, and now it's been revealed what the hammer is. In fact, what the real world is, and Heidegger accepts that. He says, "Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's how we experience it." And of course, there is a world apart from us. Otherwise, we would be sort of Bishop Berkeley idealists. There's a world that goes on after we die individually, after the species dies. It'd be sort of nuts not to acknowledge that, and Heidegger does. And by the way, I need to mention, Heidegger has a horrible political history, which I'm just not talking about. Leave that aside. But I think he's right about this. Seems so to me, and I still think so. But Heidegger says, okay, so that's a moment that we all have, this moment when the meaning slips off of things. The hammer sits there like a broken, like a piece of metal and a piece of wood, and that's it. Or we repeat the word ketchup until it loses all significance. We have those moments. They may be as profound as the one of the protagonist of Nausea, the Sartre book. But why do we think those moments are the revelation of truth? Why do we invest so much in that traditionally we have spent so little time exploring the incredibly rich and complex world of appearance, if you want, that we live in? We can discard all that as, that's all just us projecting meaning. But in doing so, we literally discard everything that matters to us. And so Heidegger wants to refocus thought on exploring everyday experience and seeing what it tells us about important ideas. And I think that's I agree with Heidegger. He changed the way I think about things, it changed my anxiety and depression to some extent. But you still have to deal with the fact that, I mean, you can't just write off the real, and Heidegger doesn't. He just doesn't focus on it. But there are other ways in which the real, the world apart from our understanding and awareness and perception of it, that the real intrudes into our world without breaking the world, without diminishing it. Because the chestnut tree in Nausea becomes diminished. Everything is removed from it so that we can't even call it a tree. There are ways in which the real intrudes into our everyday life that don't diminish meaning. In fact, they are really, really common. So I'm going to give you an example of one. Let's say you are out for a walk on a very nice day, and you pass a very nice pond because you're the privileged sort of person who can take nice walks and pass nice ponds. And for no reason, you notice there's a rock on the shore of the pond, and more or less just your body reaches down for it. Your mind's not thinking too much about it. You reach down for it. It's interesting, and you give it a heft, and your body remembers now why you picked up that rock. And what it remembers is the time when you were 5 years old, and your older cousin picked up a rock much like it. Now, and then the older cousin did this thing that was amazing. And it's amazing because even when you're 5, you know some stuff. And what you know about water is that it's the thing that shapes itself around any shape. You step into it, it makes way and exactly shapes itself around you. It accepts anything that drops into it. And the second thing you know about water is that sticks and boats float, but some stuff doesn't. And the best example of something that doesn't float is a rock. So there's your cousin, older cousin. She picks up this rock and she gives it a heft, just as you're doing now. She flips it so that the smooth side is down, and she gives it a snap. And the rock hits the water. It doesn't fall in. The water rejects it. In fact, the rock skips off the surface of the water. It's as if the water has a top, a solid top, which you had also never encountered in your 5-year-old experience. It skips off of that top and keeps skipping at mathematically beautiful intervals until the water does accept it. And meanwhile, at each point of impact, circles start to spread, and they intersect, also in mathematically beautiful ways. This is incredible. You had no idea that water and rocks could behave this way. You didn't invent this. You didn't wish it. You didn't imagine it. This is one of the ways in which the world, the real, shows itself in the world. And it's not alienating, it's not depressing, and it doesn't minimize anything about the world. In fact, it enhances it. It tells you something about rocks and water, for sure, but it also tells you that it's the presence of the real in the world that gives the world its mysteries. It's so far beyond us. We can't ever expose all of it. But it shows itself in the world, and we can discover what's in the world through the intrusion of the real. And often, sometimes it's that we stub our toe, and that's not great. But often it's also a discovery of the incredibly complex and beautiful relationships among real things. And that's what you're seeing when you skip the rock. And that's why you're probably now, as an adult, going to skip the rock again, because you want to feel the pleasure and amazement of the real's ability in its intrusion into the world to expose more of the wonder of the world and to show you its beauty and to leave you not with a glitch that shows a depressing reality, but leaves you in awe.
you.